Okay, so this is one of my first attempts to try and connect with, well, one of my first attempts on YouTube to connect with other black teachers because I am in desperate need of guidance, mentorship, feedback, which I am going to try and do by locating other black teachers. But part of the reasons why I'm making this video, and so many other black teachers will probably have some similar struggles, at least as far as I've heard in the news, is that there are so few of us. And that this isolation is one of the biggest problems. Sorry, I was letting the bus go by. Okay, so what does it mean to be a black teacher in a predominantly white institution? I think of this because I realize that I'm the first black teacher that many students will have ever had in their lives. And it's interesting because I recall my first black teacher and how important she was in my life. And it was really wonderful that I could access her all throughout the school years. She was a resource teacher and not one of the regular subject teachers, so that meant that we actually had her from the time I was in elementary school until senior year, when I was even her student assistant. So, given the fact that we know that there is no objectivity, that we all bring our subjective selves and knowledge into the classroom, how do you as black teachers deal with the fact that how do you deal with implicit bias, for example? Both in the fact that people will bring their implicit biases into the classroom, but then also this idea of speaking about implicit bias and subjectivity. I mean, when we talk about, for example, unemployment rates, and we happen to say that, this is how it is in the dominant culture, and this is how it is on the margins, and that those two things are quite instructive to understand, don't students hear something specific when that information comes from black people? It's a question, it's an impression that I have, both as a teacher but just in life, that when you speak about, as a gay person, you speak about gay issues and people think that you have a gay agenda. When you speak about race as a black person, many people who aren't accustomed to thinking about it only hear racism, and they certainly don't hear a social system that can be used, a theory that can be used to apply in other ways that we talk about hierarchy. So it's a real struggle that I have, because of course I want to keep my job, but I'm also well aware that I am called upon to think about, talk about, deal with things that most people who do what I do don't. I can give you some simple examples that might seem quite trite, but for example, speaking about black music, it's not something that many teachers would be called upon to speak about. But as we know, black music dominates youth cultures around the globe in many ways. And so, and many people see a black person that they in any way can connect with, and so they start talking about whatever their ideas about blackness are. For example, I spoke with 3 black American students a few days ago, and they were talking about this very thing, about how people wanted to connect with them, but then they would say things that were just quite offensive, inappropriate, hurtful. And so we were reminding each other of how much of a responsibility it was to be confronted, constantly confronted with other people's implicit biases and ideas about who we are, and how our very presence gives them liberty to say things. Now, we could be having the same conversation about gayness, and I know that my blackness layered with my gayness, layered with people's perception of my class identity, layered with people's perception of my religious identity, and all of this comes into play. Now, the fact that I am a minority gender gendered identity, a minority racial identity, a minority religious identity, a minority class identity. I'm one of the few people to be in the class that I am, to have transcended, to come from a working class family and now doing what I'm doing. Um, I know that that gives me a sense of awareness about who I am, and how others may perceive me, in the same way that, that the dominant culture and people coming from a dominant cultural background often omit these aspects of their lives, so that when, an older white male teacher presents information, people understand that as authority. And they don't expect for there to be any gendered, racialized, class, religious nuances. And yet we all know that everyone brings those into class, but it's pointed out, and we notice it when we do it. So how do you do it? Because one thing I did notice is that that teacher that I'm talking about, although we did have some very important discussions about race, and how that impacted her life, and yet how she was able to go ahead and do whatever she wanted to do, to study where she wanted to study, to get a job that it seemed very fulfilling to her, and all that was able to inspire me, and I'm able to connect with some of my students like that today. I also remember that same teacher almost never spoke about race in class. Now, this is the 80s and 90s, so I realize it's a different time. But I'm sitting here wondering to myself, do I simply just not speak about race, even though I know it's obvious and they know it's obvious, but they don't have the language to speak about it? Or is it just a double duty that I have to perform of helping people develop a language to speak about something that I know is uncomfortable or even invisible to them, even though it's ever present? Is it different now? I mean, how really do we do this? And I genuinely struggle with this. I genuinely struggle with wanting to empower students to do something about the fact that we live in a very hierarchically structured society, and that these hierarchies are supported by implicit biases and very, very silent handshakes between people. The hiring of people who look like you, who act like you, who sound like you, and you assume have similar values, and the everything that goes on from there. So I really do wonder, how are other people approaching the subject? And that's just my question.